You can feel completely normal, energy decent, sleep passable, exercising 3 times a week, while your body is running what amounts to a hormonal liquidation sale that started years ago without sending you a single notification. Your doctor may have tested your testosterone and told you it looked fine, and they may have been looking at exactly the wrong number. By the time most people understand what is actually happening, they have already lost somewhere between 30 and 50% of the hormone that governs their muscle mass, bone density, cardiovascular protection, cognitive sharpness, and mood regulation. And that is just as true for women as it is for men, which is the part of this story that almost nobody is telling correctly. At the end of this video, I am going to give you 3 specific actions you can take tonight, starting before you go to sleep, that I am calling the Unlock Protocol. 3 steps, each tied to a distinct biological mechanism, each targeting a different lock. But you need to understand what those locks are before the protocol makes any real sense. So let us start at the beginning. The hormone is testosterone. And before half of you mentally check out because you think this is a men's subject, stay with me. Women produce testosterone in 2 separate locations, the ovaries and the adrenal glands, those 2 small pyramid-shaped organs sitting just above your kidneys. And testosterone performs as many critical functions in the female body as it does in the male one. It regulates libido, yes, but also bone mineral density, lean muscle preservation, red blood cell production, insulin sensitivity, and what researchers now call cognitive vitality, the sharpness, motivation, and processing speed that erodes gradually and is routinely blamed on aging, stress, or depression when the hormonal infrastructure underneath it is actually what is failing. After my husband nearly died from a ruptured aneurysm and dangerously elevated cholesterol about 8 years ago, I went deep into the literature on how the body actually functions past 50. His doctors handed him a stack of medications and more or less ended the conversation there. The medications were necessary, I want to be clear about that. His situation was acute and serious, and the medical intervention is what kept him alive. But the explanation of what had gone wrong upstream, the mechanisms, the modifiable variables, the biological architecture that had been quietly collapsing for years, none of that was part of the conversation. So I became the person who read the boring stuff, the clinical trials, the meta-analyses, the endocrinology reviews that take 6 hours to get through and that nobody is going to summarize for you on television. And testosterone kept appearing in places I did not expect. Not just in muscle and sexual function, but in inflammation markers, in metabolic rate, in the regulation of visceral fat, in cardiovascular risk. The deeper I went, the more clearly I saw that almost every major health problem that accelerates after 55 has a hormonal dimension that is being undertreated, undertested, and underexplained. So let me explain it the right way. Stage by stage. Starting from the manufacturing process itself. The first stage, the factory you never knew you had. Testosterone is synthesized primarily in the Leydig cells of the testes in men and in the theca cells of the ovaries combined with the zona reticularis of the adrenal cortex in women. Here is what those terms mean in plain language. In women, production is split between 2 entirely different anatomical sites. The ovaries handle roughly half of it during reproductive years. The adrenal glands handle the other half, partly through direct production and partly through a precursor hormone called DHEA, dehydroepiandrosterone, which is a raw material the body converts into testosterone through a series of enzymatic steps. Think of DHEA as an industrial feedstock that can be assembled into several different final products, testosterone being one of them. The manufacturing process begins with cholesterol. The pathway goes from cholesterol to a molecule called pregnenolone, and from pregnenolone the body can branch into either progesterone or DHEA, and from DHEA it assembles testosterone. Cholesterol is not merely a cardiovascular risk factor. It is the foundational raw material for every major sex hormone your body produces. Without it, the factory cannot run. We spent roughly 40 years in a cultural panic about dietary cholesterol, while almost no mainstream health source explained that the same molecule being demonized was the upstream precursor to estrogen, testosterone, progesterone, and cortisol. I do not find that enraging. I find it genuinely absurd in a way that is more funny than anything else, the kind of story where the punchline is that the villain was the hero all along, and nobody updated the script. The pathway from cholesterol to testosterone is governed by the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis, a command chain that starts in the hypothalamus, a small region at the base of your brain, and runs through the pituitary gland and from there to the gonads and adrenal glands. The hypothalamus releases a signal called GnRH, gonadotropin releasing hormone, which tells the pituitary to release two hormones called LH and FSH. LH, or luteinizing hormone, is the direct order to the testicles or ovaries to produce testosterone. Think of the hypothalamus as the CEO issuing the production directive, the pituitary as the operations manager routing it, and the gonads and adrenals as the manufacturing floor executing it. When any part of that command chain degrades, and several parts of it degrade with age, testosterone production falls even when the raw materials are available. The second stage, the quiet theft, what begins in your 30s. In men, testosterone declines at approximately 1% per year beginning around age 30. This was documented in a major population-level study published in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2007, which tracked testosterone levels in thousands of men across multiple cohorts. 1% per year sounds negligible, but apply it consistently. By age 55, a man has lost roughly 25% of his peak testosterone. By 65, closer to 35%. By 70, the cumulative loss can approach 40 to 50% depending on individual health factors. In women, the trajectory is different and in important ways more severe. Testosterone in women peaks in the early 20s, typically between ages 20 and 25, and then begins a gradual decline that parallels the male pattern until perimenopause, at which point the rate of loss accelerates sharply. Research published in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism has documented that by a woman's late 40s, circulating testosterone may already be 50% lower than it was at her personal peak. By 60, some studies show levels as low as 1/4 of that original measurement. The reproductive transition that medicine labels menopause is, among other things, a testosterone event, and that framing is almost completely absent from the way menopause is typically described to women. But the number on a blood test does not tell the complete story, not even close. This is where the invisible villain enters the picture. The villain is called SHBG, sex hormone binding globulin. It is a protein produced by your liver that circulates in the bloodstream with one function: to bind testosterone and render it biologically inactive. A testosterone molecule that is attached to SHBG cannot enter your cells. It cannot signal your muscle fibers to maintain mass. It cannot cross the blood-brain barrier to support cognitive function. It is measurably present in your blood, but it is functionally inert. It is for every practical biological purpose out of circulation. Here is the postal metaphor I want you to hold for the rest of this video. Your liver produces SHBG molecules and dispatches them into the bloodstream. Testosterone is a package that gets manufactured at the factory, the gonads and adrenal glands, and placed on delivery trucks to be distributed throughout the body. SHBG is a fleet of interceptor vehicles that pulls testosterone packages off the delivery trucks before they arrive and parks them indefinitely in a locked storage facility. Total testosterone on a blood test is a measure of all the packages that left the factory. Free testosterone is the measure of how many actually reached their destination. What matters for your health is not how many packages shipped. What matters is how many knocked on your door. And here is the critical fact that most conventional medical care has been slow to act on. SHBG increases with age. The older you are, the more interceptors are on the road. This means that even when total testosterone remains relatively stable, which occasionally it does, free testosterone can be falling steeply. It is entirely possible, and actually quite common in clinical practice, to have a total testosterone reading that falls within the reference range while your bioavailable hormone, the testosterone your cells can actually use, is critically low. Many standard panels still do not routinely include free testosterone testing, which means you can walk out of a doctor's office having been told your testosterone is normal, while your body is operating on a fraction of its hormonal capacity. That gap between total and free is the story most people are not being told. And it is the gap that explains why so many people past 55 feel wrong in ways they cannot name. The erosion of motivation, the longer recovery after exercise, the slow loss of muscle despite effort, the cognitive flatness, while their labs come back unremarkable. The third stage, the women's invisible crisis. I want to stay on this before moving forward, because the female side of testosterone decline is where the mainstream conversation has been most consistently incomplete, and the consequences are serious. When women past 55 go to their doctors reporting persistent fatigue, motivational decline, reduced libido, loss of lean muscle despite regular exercise, cognitive fog, and difficulty maintaining body composition, the most common responses they encounter are antidepressant prescriptions, referrals for stress management, or the broad attribution of symptoms to menopause, followed by limited intervention. What is rarely discussed is that every one of those symptoms overlaps almost precisely with the clinical signature of low testosterone in women: the fatigue, the dulled cognition, the physical deterioration despite effort. These are testosterone symptoms, not exclusively estrogen symptoms, not simply inevitable aging. The research infrastructure for women's testosterone has historically been thin compared to men's, largely because clinical hormone research defaulted to male subjects for decades, but the evidence that exists is meaningful. A comprehensive global consensus position statement on testosterone therapy in women, published in 2019 in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism, signed by an international consortium of endocrinologists and reproductive medicine specialists, stated explicitly that postmenopausal women with low sexual desire causing clinically significant distress have sufficient evidence supporting testosterone treatment, and acknowledged that the hormone has been systematically underprescribed in this population. That is not a fringe position. That is a formal international consensus. Beyond libido, which tends to dominate the public conversation, testosterone in women is a major regulator of bone mineral density. It activates osteoblasts, the cells responsible for building new bone, and suppresses osteoclasts, the cells that break bone down. As testosterone declines after menopause, that protective effect is withdrawn at exactly the same time estrogen is also dropping. The result is a two-front assault on skeletal integrity that the calcium and vitamin D conversation barely touches. Testosterone also directly activates satellite cells inside muscle tissue. Satellite cells are the resident stem cells that get recruited to repair muscle fiber damage after physical stress. Without adequate testosterone signaling, the repair response is slower, less complete, and less effective at rebuilding fiber cross-section. This is why lean muscle mass tends to decline in postmenopausal women, even in those who continue resistance training at the same volume and intensity as before. The training stimulus is present, the hormonal amplifier of the repair response is not. You can be doing everything right from a conventional exercise perspective and still lose ground in lean mass because the repair signal is compromised. That is not a discipline failure. It is a chemistry problem. And knowing the difference matters, because the psychological weight of "I am doing everything I was told and it is not working" is one of the mechanisms by which people abandon healthy behaviors altogether. The fourth stage, the triple lock. What changes specifically after 55? After 55, three distinct mechanisms converge at the same time. This is what makes the post-55 hormonal situation categorically different from the gradual 1% per year slide of the 30s and 40s. It is not the same slope steepening. It is a structural shift involving three simultaneous processes, each one amplifying the others. The first lock is SHBG acceleration. Several hormones regulate SHBG production by the liver, including estrogen and thyroid hormones. As both decline during and after menopause, one might expect SHBG to also decline. In many individuals, the opposite happens: chronic low-grade inflammation, which increases with age, with visceral fat accumulation, and with the metabolic changes of menopause itself. upregulates SHBG synthesis in the liver. More SHBG means more interceptor trucks, more testosterone permanently locked in the holding facility, less delivered to tissues. This is a feedback loop built directly into the biology of aging. The hormonal conditions of menopause generate inflammatory conditions that further suppress bioavailable testosterone, independent of whether total testosterone is falling. The second lock is visceral fat's function as an active endocrine organ. Most people think of body fat as passive, stored energy waiting to be burned. Visceral fat, the fat that accumulates around the abdominal organs rather than under the skin, is not passive. It is metabolically active, and it is hormonally disruptive. Visceral fat contains an enzyme called aromatase. Aromatase's job is to convert androgens, testosterone being the primary one, into estradiol, a form of estrogen. The more visceral fat you carry after 55, the more of your remaining testosterone is being chemically converted into estrogen rather than being delivered as testosterone to your muscle, bone, and brain. And here is the closed loop that makes this mechanism so insidious. Low testosterone makes it harder to lose visceral fat because testosterone is a primary promoter of lean mass and metabolic rate, and a higher ratio of lean mass to fat mass is what drives resting caloric expenditure. So as visceral fat increases, more testosterone gets aromatized into estrogen. Lower testosterone makes it biologically harder to reduce visceral fat. More visceral fat accelerates aromatization. The loop tightens. This is not metaphorical. It is the documented mechanism in multiple studies examining the relationship between obesity, SHBG, testosterone, and estrogen in aging adults. The third lock is the DHEA pathway collapse. Earlier, I noted that women derive roughly half their testosterone through the adrenal glands via DHEA. DHEA production peaks in the mid-20s and declines consistently from there. Research published in the New England Journal of Medicine has documented that DHEA output by age 70 is approximately one-fifth of peak production, an 80% reduction over a human lifespan. But the DHEA collapse is not only a quantity problem, it is a competition problem, and stress is the competing force. The adrenal gland uses pregnenolone, the molecule derived from cholesterol, the foundational raw material, to produce both cortisol and DHEA. Cortisol is the primary stress hormone, the one that mobilizes glucose, suppresses non-essential systems, and keeps you alert under perceived threat. When the body is under chronic physiological stress, insufficient sleep, chronic inflammation, sustained psychological load, high glycemic eating patterns, the adrenal gland prioritizes cortisol. The pregnenolone that would have traveled down the pathway toward DHEA and ultimately toward testosterone gets redirected toward cortisol production instead. This competition for precursor molecules is real and documented in the endocrinology literature. What it means practically, every night you sleep less than 7 hours, every day you are running on a high-sugar diet, every week of unresolved physiological stress, the adrenal gland is literally choosing between making your stress hormone and making your testosterone precursor, and under stress conditions, it reliably chooses cortisol. This is happening in your body right now if you are over 55 and carrying any combination of sleep debt, elevated fasting insulin, or chronic low-grade inflammation. It is not theoretical future risk. The diversion is active and ongoing. The fifth stage, tonight, what happens in your body during the next 12 hours. This is where the timeline framing becomes immediately practical, because testosterone production follows a circadian rhythm, a 24-hour biological clock, and the window between roughly 10 at night and 6 in the morning is the single most important period for testosterone synthesis in any given day. Most people have no idea this window exists, let alone that they are disrupting it with behaviors they consider harmless or neutral. Between 9 and 10 in the evening, as light exposure decreases and cortisol begins its natural nightly decline, the body starts transitioning toward anabolic, meaning building and repairing mode. The pituitary gland begins releasing growth hormone in small pulses, Growth hormone and testosterone are not the same hormone, but they are biochemically cooperative. Growth hormone amplifies the activity of the hormone-producing cells in the gonads and adrenals and creates conditions that enhance testosterone synthesis overnight. Between approximately 11 at night and 2 in the morning, in a person who is in adequate deep sleep, the body enters its peak manufacturing window. During slow-wave sleep, the deepest stage of non-REM sleep, the pituitary releases luteinizing hormone in concentrated pulses. Luteinizing hormone is the direct order to the manufacturing floor: produce testosterone. This is when the factory runs its night shift. A study from the University of Chicago, published in JAMA in 2011, demonstrated that restricting sleep to 5 hours per night for just 1 week reduced testosterone levels in young, healthy men by 10 to 15%. These were young, healthy men with no hormonal compromise to begin with. 1 week. Now consider what years of 6-hour sleep, what many people consider adequate, does to someone already in the declining phase of a testosterone curve that has been falling for decades. The morning testosterone peak, which in most people arrives between 6 and 9 in the morning, is not produced in the morning. It is the delivery of what was manufactured overnight. What you experience as morning alertness, physical readiness, and motivational sharpness is last night's production being distributed. When the overnight production window is missed because you could not fall asleep until 1 in the morning due to screen exposure, or because your sleep was fragmented by alcohol, poor temperature regulation, or late eating, the morning peak is smaller or absent entirely. Here is a specific mechanism about late eating that connects directly to the overnight window. When you eat in the 2 to 3 hours before sleep, you trigger an insulin response. Elevated insulin at night maintains metabolic activity at exactly the moment your body is trying to downshift into repair mode. More critically, late-night eating keeps cortisol slightly elevated because the digestive and metabolic processes triggered by food require low-level adrenal activation to regulate blood glucose. That cortisol elevation, even if modest, competes with the overnight testosterone production process by diverting pregnenolone and by suppressing the LH pulse amplitude that drives testosterone synthesis. A late dinner is not neutral from a hormonal standpoint. It is a mild but real disruption to the most productive hormonal manufacturing window of your 24-hour cycle. This is why the time-restricted eating approach I have followed for several years makes deep physiological sense to me, not as a calorie reduction strategy, but as a hormonal architecture decision. When you align your eating window with the earlier and middle portion of the active day, finishing well before the evening cortisol drop begins, you are clearing the metabolic environment during exactly the period when testosterone synthesis needs it most. Research from the Salk Institute and multiple circadian biology laboratories consistently shows that aligning food intake with daylight hours and extending the overnight fast significantly improves the hormonal regulation of metabolism, including the testosterone and growth hormone production that occurs during deep sleep. You are not restricting food in a punishing sense. You are getting out of the way so the body can do what it is designed to do when nothing is competing for its resources. Here I want to mention something my husband built long before I took it seriously enough to use it. He had done what I was doing, reading the studies, tracking the circadian biology, understanding the hormonal windows, and then he did something I had not done. He converted it into a daily system. I had read all the same papers, I had highlighted the same studies. I was still inconsistent because the gap between understanding a mechanism and having a structured daily practice that makes you act on it is a gap that information alone does not close. He sat down and built the Noon Reset Protocol, a 30-day daily companion structured around exactly these circadian and hormonal principles. Each day in the guide is 2 pages, 1 page of the science behind what you are doing that day, 1 page where you track whether you actually did it, under 5 minutes of engagement per day. He designed it in 4 phases: adaptation, activation, optimization, and acceleration, because the first week of any eating window adjustment is a genuinely different physiological experience from week 3, and people who do not know that in advance tend to quit at day 5, interpreting normal adaptation discomfort as failure. One section 1 found particularly useful was the 25 breakfast meal ideas with exact protein targets, because timing your protein intake relative to your eating window turns out to matter considerably for the lean mass preservation that testosterone supports. The guide is available through the link in the description for less than a restaurant meal. I mention it here because the circadian mechanisms we just covered are precisely what it is built around. Back to the morning testosterone window, because there is one more piece of the overnight picture that changes what you should do in the first 90 minutes after waking. The testosterone produced overnight is at its highest concentration in free, bioavailable form during approximately 1 to 2 hours after waking. This is the peak delivery window, the moment when packages are actively arriving. Most people inadvertently interrupt this window in one of three ways. Eating immediately upon waking spikes insulin, which raises SHBG activity and increases cortisol, two mechanisms that collectively reduce free testosterone during the exact window it is most bioavailable. Consuming a high-sugar breakfast, still the default in most Western households, generates a rapid glucose rise followed by a reactive glucose fall that triggers adrenal cortisol secretion to stabilize blood sugar, redirecting pregnenolone away from testosterone pathways at the worst possible moment. And the third, most counterintuitive disruption, staying sedentary. Physical movement during the morning hormonal peak, a brisk walk, a brief resistance session, any movement that elevates heart rate, suppresses the morning cortisol surge, and extends the bioavailable testosterone window. Exercise is one of the most consistent and well-documented methods for acutely reducing the cortisol to testosterone ratio. It is not a coincidence that individuals who train in the mornings consistently report better focus, mood, and energy throughout the day. The mechanism is partially hormonal. They are using movement to protect the morning delivery window. The last thing I want to address before the protocol concerns the psychological layer of all of this, because Carol from this channel does not separate biology from behavior. The reason most people reading or watching this content do not actually change anything is not that they lack information. It is that the environment they live in has been optimized, not by them, not for them, to produce behaviors that suppress testosterone through every mechanism we have discussed. Late light exposure from screens, high glycemic convenience food engineered to be eaten at night, sedentary work structures that minimize movement, chronic sleep debt normalized as a productivity badge. None of these things happen by accident. They are the downstream consequence of an economic environment where the people selling you evening screen time, processed snack food, and stimulants to compensate for insufficient sleep have no financial stake in your hormonal health. The information to do better is available. The environment constantly pushes against applying it. Knowing that dynamic is operating is not the same as being powerless against it, but you do have to actively design against it rather than defaulting to whatever the environment hands you. Now, the unlock protocol. 3 components, each one targeting a specific lock from stage 4. Component 1 is the sleep factory window, and it targets the first lock, fragmented sleep and late-night cortisol-suppressing overnight testosterone synthesis. The specific action: be in bed with lights off before 10:30 in the evening. The room temperature should be between 65 and 68 degrees Fahrenheit, approximately 18 to 20 degrees Celsius. The reason temperature matters: your body needs to lower its core temperature by roughly 1 to 1.5 degrees Celsius to initiate and sustain the first cycle of slow-wave sleep. A cooler room accelerates that process. A warm room delays it, compressing the deep sleep stages where LH pulsing and testosterone synthesis occur. Move your last meal to no later than 7 in the evening when possible. If that is not immediately achievable with your current schedule, shift it 30 minutes earlier per week until you reach it. Gradual adjustment prevents the social disruption that makes most scheduling changes fail. The one mistake that breaks this component entirely: bright overhead lighting or screen use within 45 minutes of sleep. The suppression of melatonin by blue spectrum light delays slow-wave sleep onset by 45 to 90 minutes in most adults, which means the testosterone production window shifts later. compresses, and is partially lost. You cannot compensate for this by sleeping longer in the morning because the pituitary's LH pulsing that drives testosterone synthesis is time anchored to the early portion of the sleep period, not to however many hours after you fell asleep. Component 2 is the aromatase interrupt, targeting the second lock, visceral fat's conversion of testosterone to estrogen via aromatase. The specific action: add at least one session of resistance training per week, positioned within 3 hours of ending your overnight fast. The specific timing matters for a specific reason. When insulin is low, as it is after a 14 to 16-hour fast, resistance training produces a measurably greater acute hormonal response than identical training in a fed, high insulin state. Multiple controlled trials have documented larger testosterone and growth hormone spikes from fasted state resistance training compared to fed state training at equivalent intensities. This is because insulin suppresses growth hormone release, and the growth hormone spike from resistance training is one of the mechanisms that amplifies testosterone production in the hours following the session. Over weeks and months, consistent resistance training also selectively reduces visceral fat, not primarily subcutaneous fat, but specifically the deep abdominal fat where aromatase enzyme is concentrated. The common error with this component is substituting cardio entirely. Steady-state aerobic exercise has genuine value. It improves cardiovascular efficiency, reduces insulin resistance, and supports overall metabolic health. But it does not produce the acute hormonal spike or the specific visceral fat reduction that comes from resistance training. For the purposes of targeting the aromatase mechanism, they are not interchangeable. You need both, but the resistance component is the one specifically addressing lock 2. Component 3 is the precursor defense, and it targets the third lock, the pregnenolone diversion toward cortisol, that depletes testosterone raw materials under chronic stress and nutritional deficiency. This component has two parts. The first is zinc. Zinc is a direct enzymatic cofactor in the conversion of androstenedione to testosterone, a specific step in the synthesis pathway that requires zinc to proceed. Zinc deficiency measurably impairs testosterone synthesis, and a meta-analysis published in the journal Nutrients examining multiple randomized controlled trials found that zinc supplementation in zinc-deficient individuals produced significant increases in testosterone levels. Foods with the highest zinc bioavailability include oysters, which are the single most concentrated dietary zinc source by a considerable margin, followed by red meat, shellfish, and pumpkin seeds. If your diet is predominantly plant-based, be aware that phytates in grains and legumes bind zinc and reduce absorption by 20 to 40%. A supplemental dose of 15 to 25 milligrams of elemental zinc daily is within the range used in research trials, but discuss any supplement change with your doctor because excessive zinc intake suppresses copper absorption and creates a separate set of problems. This is not optional background information. Zinc toxicity from oversupplementation is real and documented. The second part of the precursor defense is resolving sleep debt specifically, not just reducing general stress. This distinction matters because it is where most people make a substitution that does not work. The pregnenolone steal is driven fundamentally by the adrenal gland's need to maintain cortisol output when the body is reading an unresolved physiological threat signal. And the most reliable physiological threat signal in modern life is chronic partial sleep deprivation. Consistently sleeping 6 hours instead of 7.5 night after night. This keeps the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis in a persistently elevated state. That axis governs cortisol. When it is chronically activated, DHEA production is downregulated, pregnenolone is redirected, and the testosterone precursor supply contracts. People try to address this with meditation, breathing exercises, and stress management techniques. Those interventions have genuine value and are worth doing, but they do not override the hormonal response to sleep deprivation because sleep debt is a physiological stressor. It raises inflammatory cytokines, elevates evening cortisol, and suppresses immune function regardless of your emotional state or your mindfulness practice. You cannot think your way out of a physiological deficit. The fix is sleep, not attitude. The reason the Unlock protocol functions as an integrated system rather than 3 isolated actions is that each component reduces the inputs driving the other 2 locks. Adequate sleep reduces morning cortisol, which reduces pregnenolone diversion, which means more raw material is available for testosterone production. Resistance training reduces visceral fat over time, which reduces aromatase activity, which means more of the testosterone being produced reaches its destination rather than being converted to estrogen. Zinc and protected pregnenolone supply means the factory is running at capacity, so there is sufficient testosterone being manufactured to make the improvements in delivery and bioavailability from the first two components actually meaningful. These three actions are not additive, they interact. Addressing all three simultaneously produces a combined effect that is considerably greater than any one of them would achieve alone. One necessary clarification. Everything in the Unlock protocol addresses the modifiable factors behind natural testosterone optimization. If you have clinically diagnosed hypogonadism, a medical determination made by an endocrinologist through appropriate testing, including free testosterone, total testosterone, LH, FSH, and SHBG, testosterone replacement therapy is a separate clinical conversation. The protocol is not a substitute for medical treatment when medical treatment is indicated. Individual hormonal landscapes vary significantly. Results vary. Any significant change to your supplement regimen, eating schedule, or exercise programming should be discussed with your physician, particularly if you have existing metabolic, cardiovascular, or hormonal conditions. I am not a doctor. I am someone who reads the literature until it makes practical sense and then explains it in plain language. That distinction matters. The larger story behind all of this, and this is the last point I want to make before closing, is about what does not get explained and why. The downstream consequences of declining testosterone in women over 55 are individually diagnosable and individually treatable. Osteoporosis has a medication category, mood disorders have a medication category, low libido has a medication category, cardiovascular risk has a medication category. Each of those categories represents a separate clinical intervention and a separate revenue stream. The upstream conversation that these conditions share a hormonal precursor, that testosterone decline is measurable, that free testosterone testing is cheap and accessible, and that several of the most important drivers of that decline are modifiable without prescription. That conversation does not have a profit center attached to it. This is not a conspiracy. Conspiracies require coordination. What this is incentive structure. When the economic incentives of an industry align with treating consequences rather than addressing causes, you consistently get a system that treats consequences. I find that more sad than sinister. But either way, the result is the same. You get managed rather than informed. You now have the mechanism, you have the three locks, you have the protocol. What you do tonight with that information is yours to decide. If you are starting the Unlock protocol this week, comment the word unlocked below so I can see who is actually doing this. And subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of conversation this channel exists for.